It's about what?
I'm sad for those who don't feel that they are loved in order to work in this life.
There are people in this world who seem too good to be real, too patient, too kind, too steady. And when we lose them, we tend to place them on a pedestal so high that they no longer feel human. Fred Rogers was one of those people. For more than 3 decades, he walked through that familiar television door, changed into his cardigan, laced up his sneakers, and spoke directly to the hearts of children across America. His voice was unhurried. His eyes held warmth that felt personal. And his message, that you were worthy of love exactly as you were, reached millions of people who desperately needed to hear it. But Fred Rogers died on February 27, 2003, after a short but brutal battle with stomach cancer. He was 74 years old, and when he passed, a quietness fell over the people who knew him best. His colleagues grieved, his fans mourned, and his wife, JoAnn Rogers, the woman who had shared his life for over 50 years, stepped back from the public eye and carried her grief privately. For years, JoAnn said very little. She protected his memory carefully. She spoke at select events, appeared briefly in documentaries, and kept the details of their private life largely to herself. But as time passed, and as the world's fascination with Fred Rogers only deepened, JoAnn began to open up. And what she shared wasn't scandalous. It wasn't a betrayal of his legacy, but it was real, honest, and at times, genuinely difficult to hear. Because she wasn't describing a saint. She was describing a man complex, devoted, flawed in the most human ways, and deeply loved. This is the story of what JoAnn Rogers finally said, and why it matters. Before we can understand what JoAnn revealed, we have to understand who JoAnn Rogers was. She was not simply the wife of a famous man. She was, in her own right, a woman of remarkable talent, intelligence, and character. Born JoAnn Bird in 1928 in Jacksonville, Florida, she grew up in a household that valued music, curiosity, and substance over flash. From a young age, it was clear that JoAnn had an extraordinary gift for the piano. She wasn't learning scales just to pass time. She was communicating something. Music was her first language. She pursued that language seriously. She attended Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida, where she majored in music performance. She later continued her studies at Florida State University and at Carnegie Tech, now known as Carnegie Mellon University, in Pittsburgh. She was no hobbyist. She became a serious concert pianist, eventually performing as part of a duo with her longtime friend and collaborator Janine Morrison. Together, they recorded 2 albums that showcased classical and virtuoso piano repertoire. JoAnn was accomplished, independent, and driven by a love of art that had nothing to do with anyone's last name. It was at Rollins College that she first met Fred Rogers. They were both music students, both drawn to the deeper questions that art tends to provoke, and both, though neither would have said it at the time, exactly what the other needed. Fred was quiet, thoughtful, and possessed a gentleness that felt unusual even then. JoAnn was sharp, grounded, and had a warmth beneath her composed exterior that few people got to see right away. Their friendship grew slowly, as the best ones do. They shared practice rooms and musical conversations, and a growing sense that the other person understood something essential about the world. When Fred eventually left Florida to begin a career in New York with NBC, they maintained their connection through letters. This was the 1950s. No instant messages, no phone calls at the touch of a button, just handwritten pages crossing state lines, each one carrying a little more of themselves. Fred's proposal came in one of those letters. JoAnn was so overcome that she ran to a nearby phone booth to call him and say yes before she had even finished reading to the end. She kept that letter for the rest of her life. They married in 1952, and what followed was more than 5 decades of partnership, challenge, laughter, music, and the kind of love that isn't built in a single moment but assembled slowly, through every ordinary day. Fred Rogers was, by nearly every account, genuinely kind. This is not in dispute. The people who worked alongside him for decades, crew members, producers, guest artists, colleagues at WQED in Pittsburgh, have spoken consistently about a man whose on-screen warmth was not a performance. He remembered people's names. He asked about their families. He sent handwritten notes. He prayed for strangers he encountered. The kindness was real, but Joanne Rogers was careful, when she finally began to speak more openly, to push back against the idea that her husband was somehow above struggle, above doubt, or beyond the ordinary friction of a human life. She made a point of saying, in interviews and in the 2018 documentary Won't You Be My Neighbor, directed by Morgan Neville, that Fred was no saint. Not in a dismissive way, not to diminish him, but because she understood that flattening him into something perfect would ultimately make him less useful to the world, not more. The man she described was someone who carried an enormous amount of emotional weight. Fred Rogers felt things deeply, perhaps more deeply than most people realized. Every child who wrote to him, every family struggling with loss or fear or displacement, every viewer who turned to his show as a refuge. He held all of that. He didn't manage it from a distance. He absorbed it, and that kind of sustained empathy, practiced over 31 years of television, takes a toll. Joanne spoke about the discipline behind the warmth. Fred kept strict routines. He woke early and spent time in prayer every morning. He swam daily. He maintained his weight at 143 pounds, a number he had assigned a private meaning to, with one letter in I, for in love, and 3 in you. He went to bed early. He did not drink. He was, in terms of personal habits, almost ascetic in his self-regulation. But Joanne made clear that this discipline was not effortless. It was chosen every single day, against the pull of exhaustion and doubt and the natural human tendency to let things slide. There were harder things, too. Fred could be difficult to reach emotionally in the ways that ordinary domestic life requires. Joanne has spoken candidly about the fact that she was usually the one who handled discipline with their 2 sons, James and John. Fred found that role deeply uncomfortable. His instinct was always to soften, to comfort, to understand, all qualities that made him extraordinary in front of a camera and more complicated as a parent. Joanne bore the weight of those harder parental moments, while Fred remained the gentle presence he was constitutionally built to be. That imbalance was real, and Joanne didn't pretend otherwise. She also acknowledged that his work consumed him in ways that a family simply has to accept or struggle against. Fred poured himself into the show, into every word of every episode, into the selection of guests and the writing of songs and the voicing of puppets. There was very little left untouched by his sense of mission. For Joanne, that meant learning how to support something that sometimes left little room for anything else. She did it, but it wasn't always easy, and she has said so. What makes Joanne's account of their marriage so affecting is precisely that it resists idealization. They had a real marriage, not a prop or a public relations arrangement, but an actual life together, with all the texture and difficulty that entails. Music was their common ground from the beginning and remained so for the rest of Fred's life. Even in his final weeks, when his body was failing him and the cancer had taken much of his strength, he would sit at the piano. Joanne described him playing softly, slowly, finding comfort in the keys when words were no longer adequate. It was how they had always communicated at the deepest level, not through declarations or grand gestures, but through the language they had both spoken since childhood. They played piano duets together throughout their marriage. They laughed. They disagreed. They navigated the particular strangeness of being married to someone who was also, in some sense, a public possession, a figure that millions of people felt they personally knew and owned. That is a quietly strange thing to live with, and Joanne managed it with a grace that largely went unnoticed because she was not the one in the cardigan. She was also the person who anchored him. Fred Rogers, for all his certainty about kindness and love, was not a man without anxiety. He worried about whether he was doing enough. He was sensitive to criticism in ways that surprised people who expected someone so publicly secure to be immune to it. He carried the responsibility of his influence seriously, perhaps too seriously at times. Joanne was the person he could be uncertain with. She didn't need him to perform steadiness for her. She already knew the whole man. Their son John Rogers has echoed this. In interviews over the years, he has described his mother as the foundation beneath everything, the person who made it possible for his father to give so much of himself to the world because she provided the stability that kept the household intact. That's an enormous thing to be, and it's a role that rarely gets the recognition it deserves. In the fall of 2002, Fred Rogers began experiencing digestive discomfort that he initially dismissed. He was not a man who complained about his body. He managed his health carefully and quietly, and early on, the symptoms seemed manageable. A bit of indigestion, some discomfort after eating, things that could be explained away. Joan has recalled that he was patient with the growing unease, careful about his diet, hoping it would resolve. It did not resolve. When he finally sought medical answers, the news was devastating. He had stomach cancer, aggressive, advanced, and already spread beyond the point where treatment could offer more than temporary relief. The diagnosis came fast. The decline came faster. Joan has described the months between his diagnosis and his death as among the most profound and painful of her life. Not because Fred fell apart, he didn't. He remained, in his essential character, the same man he had always been. But illness has a way of stripping away the performances we give even for ourselves, and in those final months, Fred Rogers was simply a man facing death. He was frightened at moments. He was tired. He grieved the things he would not be able to do and the people he would not be able to reach. In January of 2003, barely weeks before he died, Fred appeared as the Grand Marshal of the Tournament of Roses parade in Pasadena, California. People who saw him there have said he looked frail but present, deeply, deliberately present. It was a gesture of commitment, of showing up for something bigger than his own comfort, in the way he always had. It was perhaps one of his last public acts. He came home from the hospital after surgery and spent his final days in the place he loved most. He died on February 27, 2003, at home, surrounded by Joan and their family. It was, by all accounts, a peaceful end for a man who had spent his life making peace possible for others. After Fred died, Joan Rogers largely withdrew. She gave occasional interviews, appeared at tribute events, and served in a leadership capacity at Fred Rogers Productions, the company that continued his work. But she was not a frequent presence in the media, and she spoke very guardedly about the personal dimensions of their life together. Part of this was temperament. Joan Rogers was never a woman who sought the spotlight. She had built her own career quietly, on the merits of her musicianship and her teaching, without needing public recognition to validate it. Grief, for her, was also not something to be performed. She carried it privately, but there was something else at work, too. She understood, perhaps better than anyone alive, the particular weight of Fred Rogers' legacy. She understood how much his memory meant to people, not just as nostalgia, but as something actively sustaining. People who had grown up watching him still turned to the memory of his voice when they were afraid. Adults who had experienced difficult childhoods spoke of him as a lifeline. The responsibility of that was not lost on her. As time passed, though, Joan came to a different conclusion about what honoring Fred truly required. She came to believe that presenting him as flawless wasn't a tribute. It was a distortion. And distortions, however well-intentioned, ultimately do a disservice to the truth that Fred himself was always trying to tell, that people are worthy of love not because they are perfect, but because they are real. So she began to speak more fully. She participated in Morgan Neville's documentary. She gave longer interviews. She shared details about his final illness, his private struggles, and the texture of their marriage that she had previously kept close. And what emerged was a portrait that, paradoxically, made Fred Rogers more admirable, not less, because it made him human in a way that his public image, for all its warmth, never fully achieved. She also made a brief but meaningful cameo in the 2019 film A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, in which Tom Hanks portrayed Fred. Her appearance in the film was not incidental. It was Joan choosing, in her quiet way, to place herself within the story being told about her husband. A gentle insistence on her own presence in a narrative that the world sometimes told as if he had walked through it alone. One of the most striking things Joan Rogers shared publicly was her honesty about what grief actually looked like for her. There is a cultural expectation, especially for the widow of a beloved public figure, that grief will be managed with a certain composure, that she would speak of her loss in measured tones and draw comforting conclusions for the people watching. Joan declined that expectation. She said plainly that grief does not work on a schedule. She described days when she felt energized and capable, and days when she felt completely depleted. She talked about the way loss moves in waves rather than in a straight line, and how the world's desire for her to be over it after a reasonable amount of time bore no resemblance to the actual experience of missing someone who had been the center of her life for over 50 years. This was itself a Fred Rogers kind of message, radical in its ordinariness, revolutionary in its willingness to simply say the true thing. Fred had built a career on telling children that their feelings were real and valid, and not something to be ashamed of. Joanne, in her grief, was doing exactly the same thing for adults. She was modeling what it looks like to tell the truth about loss without prettying it up. She said, in one widely quoted reflection, that she had told Fred before he died that they would be all right, that their sons would be fine, that she would try to be fine, and she believed that he went in peace because of that. But she was also clear that peace for him and peace for her were two different things, and that her own journey through loss was long, uneven, and ongoing. Even as she mourned, Joanne Rogers worked. She served as chair emerita of Fred Rogers Productions and was a guiding presence in the decisions that shaped how his work continued after his death. Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, the animated series that carries forward Fred's approach to emotional literacy for a new generation of young children, exists in part because of Joanne's stewardship of his vision. She understood what he was trying to do well enough to help others do it without him. She also understood the limits of legacy, the ways that a person's image can harden into something that serves the public's need for comfort rather than the truth of who they actually were. She resisted that hardening, not through any dramatic intervention, but through her consistent willingness to say, when asked, that Fred was a real person, with a real marriage, real struggles, and real moments of doubt. She gave his goodness back its weight by refusing to make it effortless. Joanne Rogers passed away on January 14, 2021. She was 92 years old. She died in Pittsburgh, the city where she and Fred had built their life, surrounded by her family. She was survived by her two sons and by a legacy that, in its quieter way, was as remarkable as her husband's. Her piano still sat in their home. Her records of duo performances still exist. The albums she made with Janine Morrison, the years she spent teaching young musicians, the private ways she shaped the man who shaped a generation, all of it is part of a story that most people never fully knew. She didn't need them to. She had always been comfortable with that. There is something important in what Joanne Rogers chose to share in the years before her death. She was not exposing her husband. She was not correcting a myth by replacing it with a darker one. She was doing something far more valuable. She was insisting on his humanity. Fred Rogers spent his entire career telling children, and through them, adults, that who you are is enough, that feelings are not shameful, that struggle and doubt and fear are not evidence of failure, but simply evidence of being alive. And yet, in the decades after his death, the world was doing to Fred exactly what he had spent his life teaching against, flattening him into an ideal, stripping away his complexity, turning him into a symbol rather than a person. Joanne gave him back his personhood. She said, he got tired. He worried. He wasn't always easy to live with. He struggled with aspects of parenting. He faced death with courage, but also with fear. He was a man who chose kindness as a practice rather than a person who was simply born free of the impulse to be otherwise. And that, the choosing of it, the daily, disciplined, unglamorous work of being the person he committed to being, is the most inspiring version of his story. Because if Fred Rogers had simply been born gentle, his gentleness wouldn't mean very much. But if he was someone who worked at it, who chose it in the face of exhaustion and doubt, who had hard days and still showed up for other people, then his example is actually useful. It's something the rest of us can reach toward. It's permission to try. That is what Joanne Rogers gave the world when she finally broke her silence. Not an awful truth in the tabloid sense, but a deeper, more demanding truth. That goodness is not a trait you are given. It is a choice you make, over and over, for as long as you are given time to make it. And for Fred Rogers, that time was 74 years. And for the people he reached, the children who grew up feeling seen, the adults who still hear his voice when the world is too loud, the time he gave them goes on, long past the last day he laced up his sneakers and sang about being a neighbor. Joanne knew that man, all of him, and she loved him anyway. Maybe that's the most important thing she ever told us.